Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming. One little bit of housekeeping. If you happen to have a cell phone on you, just make sure that the sound is turned off. So one quick question for you all. We want to geek out a bit about regenerative agriculture, but we want to geek out just about the right amount. So how many folks in here are expert in regenerative agriculture? How many experts do we have in the room? So we have quite a few experts. How many people know a bit about regenerative agriculture? All right, good number of folks. And how many people are pretty new to this? Also a good number of folks. Okay, so the experts, you might you might take a backseat to everybody else. So one of the things that Vincent alluded to is how important regenerative agriculture is, what the inherent value is, and I think all of us are here because we get that in some way. But the current situation is that something around 1% of agricultural land in the US is currently certified organic. The vast majority of the ag land is conventionally farmed. The IPCC says that we have 12 years to drastically cut our greenhouse gas pollution. And the world is starting to wake up to the realization that agriculture can be a huge solution to the climate problem. So the question we have to deal with tonight is, how do we accelerate this transition? We all know it's super essential. We know it makes sense on so many levels. Chef Mary is going to tell us why the food is so much more delicious. It's so much more nutritious. We're going to talk about all the investment opportunities, all of these cultural opportunities, but what's holding it back? What are the bottlenecks? And how can this community that Patagonia is helping to weave together figure these things out as fast as possible so we can get to that future? So I'm going to let all of our amazing panelists introduce themselves a little bit. And Mary, maybe we'll start with you, just because I see you smiling. Audience a little bit about your background and then what you're most excited about and what your big worries are.
Well, I started cooking in New York in the late 70s, and I've been running a catering and events business since then. I also operated a restaurant in the Chelsea market for 15 years called The Green Table. And Cleaver Co. runs also kiosks in Battery Park during the 6 warm months of the year. And my husband, after 35 years in the film business, decided he wanted to become a farmer 7, 8 years ago. And so we now own some land in Washington County, which is the northernmost county in the Hudson Valley, where we farm, raise pastured poultry, certified organic vegetables and flowers, and also heritage breed turkeys, and raised a few pigs last year too. The mission of my business has always been to support the regional farm and food economy. I was surprised when I moved to New York in the late 70s that you couldn't find a local tomato here in August. I didn't understand that at all. And so our business has been very mission driven all these years to help bring local farm product into the marketplace of New York City, where we have many mouths to feed and farmers can stay in business if they have a marketplace. So so I'm very passionate and excited about that always. I am worried that we are busy poisoning our population in this country. I don't understand that, and we all need to think and learn more about how our food is produced, and we can all be creators to make the change.
All right, thank you. Erica, do you want to go?
Hopefully everyone can hear me. I'm Erica from Stone Barn Center for Food and Agriculture. We are a nonprofit organization working to change the way America eats and farms. And what we really mean by that is we're trying to bring agriculture, food culture into closer working relationships. So as Vincent was saying and Charlie was saying, we really think there has to be a lot of coordination and support for what farmers are doing. We need to create markets so that farmers can farm in these ways and have a place to sell their product. And at the same time, we need to change change the way we eat so that we're excited about eating the kind of products that we're asking farmers to grow for our own health and for the environment. So we're trying to bring agriculture and food culture together in that way. And we work a lot on training young farmers because we think that a lot of the opportunity for putting regenerative practices into place is going to rest with the next generation of farmers. And we can talk a little more about why that is later. But we do a lot of work training young farmers, and we do a lot of work on our own farm, which if you haven't been to Stone Barns, I hope you'll come up and visit us. We're just about a 40-minute train ride up the Hudson, and I hope that you'll come up and see us participate in a program. We have about 80 acres of property there, and then in coordination with New York State, we're grazing an additional 350 acres of public lands. So an interesting public-private collaboration there that we can talk more about. But I hope that we'll see you up there and we can get into some of this a little bit more. In terms of excited, I think regenerative agriculture really presents us with a solution, a way to put carbon back into the soil or to keep carbon in the soil in the face of this really epic challenge we have with climate change. So it's incredibly exciting that there are solutions that farmers implement and that we can support them to implement. My biggest worry is that we won't quickly, and that there are lots of studies telling us how few years we really have left of topsoil before all the topsoil's eroded and before before the water's too warm. So that's my biggest concern is speed.
Excellent.
My name is Kirby. That's my best. So I guess I would describe, I'm from Texas originally, but I live upstate in Dallas. Louder. Hold on. Is it catching it? My voice doesn't. Ooh, okay. I have to say my voice doesn't carry, but doesn't.
Talk like you're at the beach talking to somebody down the beach.
Against the wind.
Against the wind.
So as I'm Kirby, I live upstate in Dutchess County. I guess I would describe myself as an accidental investor. I was trained originally in conservation biology, sort of one of those idealistic young folk hoping to save the world. And realized I didn't know where the money was coming from that was helping the work I was doing, and started digging down that rabbit hole and quickly realized I needed to help in that regard. So for a while I have worked and continue to work in investment and philanthropy around trying to fund these type of initiatives, whether it's farming oriented or the businesses. Oh wow. I'll just keep going until it happens again. And I think what I focus on now a lot is trying to figure out, as we shift towards this idea of regenerative, which puts language to me around being and trying to think of the whole as opposed to the individual nodes. I've focused a lot on how that reflects in the finance space. So instead of thinking short-term, transactional, focused, and control, how the actual financing perspective can sort of mirror that regenerative approach. So I think I've tried to play in that space, and I always like to think of it as
This one? Ooh. Can everyone hear me now? Amazing. So I guess I'll just jump to what I'm most excited about. I think I heard someone the other day I'm always the token millennial in a lot of conversations, and people will say, oh, millennials want to work in work that's impactful, or they want to be working on these things. And I want to emphasize that we need to. I think I have that sort of existential threat that I feel, transparently when I'm thinking about having kids. So, if I want to. So I think that kind of scares me a bit, in that sort of urgency in a lot of ways. But I think what I'm most excited about with food as a solution is that it's actually something that we interact with 3 times a day, and you can do with friends and family. So knowing that there is an option that is actually very human and tangible and repeated in my life, I think is really helpful, whereas some of the other solutions I encounter are very, far away, or I don't truly understand them. So I think that's what I'm most excited about.
So it sounds like the sense of urgency, this need for speed is one of the key things. So if we look at the limiting factors in the transition to regenerative ag, what are their training, their access to land, access to capital, de-risking the transition from conventional to regenerative, access to customers. So why don't we take the training piece? Do you guys want to talk about what training materials are out there and what do we still need? What resources are there for people that are looking to get involved, and what do we still need more of?
Start on that one. So I think just to set the, we're doing this now? Okay. Just to set the context a little bit, 50, 60 years ago, we asked farmers in this country to kind of get big or get out of the farming business and to grow more of just a few, as Vincent was saying, of a relatively few crops. And they did that. And, we as a country put a lot of incentives in place and policy in place, and business put a lot of incentives in place to support that system. And so farmers did what we asked, and they did a great job with what we asked. So now if we want to ask farmers to do something different, we have to change the conditions and enable them to be able to do the kind of farming that is not only going to consider input and output, but it's going to consider environmental consequences and opportunities, and health consequences and opportunities, and flavor, frankly, and good food consequences and opportunities. So I think the context that we're in is that we have a lot of farmers who are aging in this country. We've got the average farmer in this country is about a little under 60 years old. Very few farmers under age 35. So we know we need a new generation of farmers. The farmers are in their 60s, 70s, 80s, the vast majority of them, and they're really heavily invested in the system that we set up for them to be invested in. So we need to figure out, as Suzanne said, a way to transition them out where they are able to retire and take care of their families. And at the same time, we need to get new farmers onto land. We need to find creative ways to do that so that they can afford to be on land and actually and do this kind of farming. And then we need to train them. So we need to set the kind of big context and enabling conditions, but we also need training, because one thing about regenerative agriculture that I think was probably evident from Vincent's description of it is that it's very knowledge intensive. You need to know a lot about a lot of things in order to do it well. And it's also evolving, and we're learning more all the time. So it's a very knowledge intensive thing. A lot of training needed. So it's one of the things that we work on at Stone Barns, but I would say New York is a very exciting place to be. There are a lot of organizations in New York working on farmer training. The National Young Farmers Coalition is a wonderful organization that's based here in New York. Glenwood is an organization in the Hudson Valley. Soulfire Farm is a great organization that trains farmers. I'll let Kirby talk a little bit about there's a new actually coalition that's forming in the Hudson Valley of all of these organizations, or many organizations that are working together. So you want to talk a little bit?
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to. Definitely. So I think on this point of how knowledge intensive it is, an example of a New York State champion in this is a guy named Tim Joseph, who started Maple Hill Creamery, which you might have seen in natural food stores. It's 100% organic, grass-fed yogurt and dairy. And he said what the hardest thing for people to transition, particularly if you're coming from industrial, conventional dairy, is he always says you have to remove the grain and insert the brain. Because it is just, they're so used to, I put in this input and I get this output, but then when you're looking at the mixture of grasses on your grassland and how healthy your soil is in your pastures, it's just a completely different game. So I think that's a big challenge. I think on the point of educating young farmers in regenerative agriculture practices, just like we said to farmers many years ago, get big or get out, a lot of our agricultural institutions that are educating are still educating in that model. And so something I've seen, and an example that Erica and I actually both get to work on, is finding those organizations who are promoting this and who are teaching and getting them to work together. So wearing the funder hat a little bit, something I was disillusioned with in watching investment and finance and philanthropy is chasing the new shiny thing. It's always what's the new exciting thing. Yet there's an enormous amount of good work going on there already. And so an example of one of these things in the Hudson Valley that's just formed as of a couple months ago, is the Hudson Valley Farmer Training Collaborative. So we're now up to 7 organizations, all nonprofits in the Hudson Valley. It's sort of like this little belt all the way up the river. Everyone has a focus on regenerative agriculture. Everyone has sort of a different approach to it. You know, some of them have young farmers who are going down to the markets in the city at Union Square. Some of them are on site and doing livestock. Some are vegetable oriented. So we're working on this project in order to help the groups work together and also to sort of help serve what is a really exciting new generation of young farmers. A lot of these young farmers have never farmed. It's not just, you know, I used to be a farmer and I'm taking over my family farm. They'll learn. But they're also, I mean, what's incredible is you meet some of these young people, I'm saying that, they're probably my age or older, and they're activists. They're asking about equity and inclusion. They're talking about how do I, you know, bring people onto the farm and not just grow vegetables or, you know, livestock. So I think that's something we're grappling in the education space, is what it means to be a new farmer, both to survive economically in the farm, but also to sort of be an activist in thinking about climate change and otherwise, is another thing that a lot of these groups are trying to grapple with.
So just in contrast to all these young new farmers on the East Coast, there are a lot of farmers who've been farming for a long time, or folks that grew up on a farm who may want to transition or are thinking about transitioning to new ways of doing things. So why would they not? Why would they not? Probably risk. Probably there's some capital investments. Probably they need contracts, that kind of thing. So Vincent or Mary, do you want to talk a bit about what big buyers can do? So there's vegetable, there's what, you know, the ag policy world would call specialty crops, i.e. everything we eat. But in terms of grains and things, you know, there are farmers that are farming thousands of acres and they're doing brilliant rotations. They're doing all kinds of complex, ecologically thoughtful, interesting things, integrating livestock. And they need big buyers. They need, you know, very complicated, you know, very thoughtful, intentional contracts. Let's get into that a little bit, because we're not just talking about, you know, small little quaint vegetable farms. We're talking about millions and millions of acres that we need to turn back into that deep, rich prairie soil with crops that are really rebuilding the soil. So let's get into that side of it. He's got a mic.
So our food business is fairly small, but farms also grow most of the fiber, or half of the fiber we use, cotton and hemp, and then a good part of the line comes from wool, which is from holistically grazed land. One of the things that we did about 15 years ago, and this is not so much in agriculture, but we discovered when we were working with over 150 factories that we really couldn't we couldn't have a relationship with them that meant anything. We couldn't really have conversations about what we were hoping for them to do. And so we cut it down to about 50. And I think we now have a pretty strong relationship in the clothing world of having long-range relationships with our suppliers, where we have asked them to make changes about how they hire, how they treat their workers, how they deal with their chemicals. They know that we're also behind them on the other end and that we won't be walking away. And the same thing has to go on with the farms. The farmers have to have a reliable customer. I described that no one would grow Kernza until we came up with the beer. That's still going to be the responsibility of people in the food community to support the farmers who are producing the goods.
Yeah, I think chefs, there's a lot of attention chefs are paying now to what they can do also to help influence how farmers are growing their food and also how to support more of the regional farm and food economy that they're located in, and how they can support even small producers, which I think we all understand is a big part of it too, because a lot of small producers will make a big producer, and also can get, you can affect more. The more land you can affect, the better. So, so chefs can have a large influence on how farmers are producing their food, what they're doing. The chef's job is to feed and nurture people. So we want to make sure that that's happening with food that is alive and nutritious and life-giving. So and tastes delicious. So food that tastes good has to come from soil that's healthy, and soil that's healthy comes from soil that's treated well, and crops are rotated, and all the different things that need to happen to keep those microbes vital and growing and producing delicious, healthy food have to happen. So, the buyer is can be a big influence on every scale, and it's really exciting that Patagonia is doing the work that they're doing with making a large difference. And yeah, we need to move the crop, move all of the growing practices away from. We need to get policy change. We need to have, regenerative growing practices supported by our government, as well as commodity crops. I mean, it's just there's huge change on every level that needs to happen. And one of the things that's happening in terms of training too is that American Farmland Trust, for example, has a program called FarmLink, where they match landowners who are not farming their land with farmers who need land, and that's a big help, because the cost of land is very high, particularly in the Northeast and the Hudson Valley. So that's another good, that linked with the kind of practices that are going on in these educational institutions. And yes, if we can get our Cornell, our university land trust in this state is doing a lot to train farmers, but they need to get with the program on regenerative agriculture as well. So there's a lot to do.
And so you brought up policy. So why don't we move on to that? So and you talk, and it's interesting because, for those of you who are all in movements, if you're part of social justice movements or environmental movements, a lot of the conversation right now is about being good allies and really understanding what other stakeholders need. And farmers are making really long-term decisions. It takes many years to rebuild soil. It takes many years to develop, say, grapevines. They don't produce a full crop until year 5 often. So these long-term, really reciprocal relationships are super important, but we're not operating in a vacuum. We work within these policy frameworks, many of which have dramatic impacts on the financial viability of many of these different practices. So let's talk about policy. So there's our federal policy is the Farm Bill. I don't hear any audible groans, so we don't have too many people that work on federal policy here. A few. That's why we have wine. And then there's a lot of interesting stuff happening in New York State as well. So who wants to start on this? We can kind of run through some of the interesting things. And you want to jump in?
I can mention a couple of interesting things. I think right now we are seeing. I mean, actually, there was some good news in the most recent Farm Bill. There are federal programs that are available to farmers that provide incentives to put in conservation measures on their farms. There's a group called the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition that does a great job of kind of interpreting that policy, and they do some great blog posts if you are interested in policy and want to dive into it a little more. It's a great resource. They also do great work with helping farmers actually go through the process of figuring out how to do those applications, because they're not always easy. But on the state level, there's a Assemblywoman Dee Dee Barrett, who's a Hudson Valley Congresswoman, recently proposed a program that would actually do research on carbon farming methods in New York State and provide farmers with more information about what works, what doesn't work, what are the implementation considerations. So, these are things that your elected officials can actually put forward at the state and local level if it's something that you voice to them is a priority for you. So I think it's important to know that there are these initiatives happening at the regional level. One other initiative that is not in New York State, but I wanted to briefly mention because I think it's a really interesting public-private partnership, and not by any means, none of these things is going to be the only solution, but in California, there's a group called the Perennial Farming Initiative. They've been very big advocates of Kernza, and they just developed a program with California where it's basically a checkoff, or a 1% surcharge in restaurants that you can elect. So if you're in a restaurant that's participating in this program, you can elect to add 1% to your bill, and that money goes directly into a fund to support farmers in California implementing healthy soil practices. So it's a way, it's interesting and innovative as a way for consumers to be able to directly say to the state of California, I want money to go towards regenerative farming practices. I want to put 1% of my restaurant bill into the hands of farmers who are doing this on their land. So I think a creative and interesting way, again, for consumers to really directly indicate to local or state government that they want to see this happening. So those are just a couple interesting examples.
I'm not experienced in policy at all, so I cannot give any sharp details to this, but at least comment on within the Farm Bill. The vast majority, as Vincent was saying, is actually going to where that massive amount of our crops are, that are corn, soy, and wheat. And so I think it's important to think about the current system is literally propped up by those subsidies. And if you're looking at, it's always wild to see the thing in the grocery store that has a bunch of ingredients that you don't know how to pronounce that comes from far away and is packaged in all of this packaging, and it's, $1.25. And then you have this tomato from up the way and it's, $9 a pound or whatever it might be. I think something that needs to shift on the policy side as to where those subsidies go is shifting more towards supporting the specialty crops and actually also proactively supporting the different ways that farmers can actually transition to organic, because I think something that's important is if you have one of those big farmers out there who have been doing corn and soy and herbicides and pesticides for years, that soil is dead. There's nothing there, in the process to getting to the point where you could even be organic, which takes 3 years to transition, but actually to have that healthy soil that gives the deliciousness and everything else, it takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of learning, and it takes a lot of investment. And so there are certain things that I think policy could play a role in helping that transition be smoother, whether it's subsidizing, investment or whatever it might be. Until that happens, I think it will be a difficult proposition for big farms to switch, and also an upstream battle for small farms to go in that direction as well.
I think we're looking at three big roadblocks, and one is finance. And I think the third is policy. The second is distribution. If we're going to have this movement extend to people who have not been able to get fresh vegetables, let alone organic, we're going to have to come up with an innovative distribution system that cuts out the 30% that's taken in the middle. And as to policy, the thing I would encourage people, lawmakers follow the money, and they follow the desire, and they follow the pressure. And I think it's easier and more productive to work right now on the local and the state level. But to start planning, the Farm Bill lasts 5 years, and we've got, 4 years to the next one. That will be, by then, we will need to put some major pressure to change the way our system is subsidized by the government.
We're going to go to audience questions pretty soon, so get your questions ready. And on that point, how many folks here have personally called up your congresspeople's offices? Yeah, this is a great crowd. This is a good crowd. For all the rest of you who didn't raise your hand, it's interesting. You can click some of these kind of digital, click this petition, that kind of thing, and activists will use those numbers to go in when they advocate. But it is, regardless of money and politics and all that stuff that makes you want to give up, politicians really do respond to their constituents. So, taking 5 minutes to call your congressperson and ask them what they're doing on agriculture, what they're doing on climate change, and to advocate for some of these policy changes that we need is essential. And I think also, again, being on the theme of how do we accelerate this transition, shaming farmers for practices that you think you don't approve of doesn't help at all. But understanding, well, why are they doing that? Well, it's because there's a subsidy for that. Because there's crop insurance and it's structured in such a way that the only option they feel that they have is to do X, Y, Z. So I think just really trying, spending your time understanding how we can, we basically have run out of time. And so now we just have to figure out how can we be effective, how can we be good allies, and how do we pressure the heck out of our representatives so that they get moving. So I think we were going to take one of these mics and go roving so folks can ask questions. We have plenty of time for questions, so we'll want to get all of your questions in, and we can do a few at a time. If you'd like to say who you are and what you do if you work in this field, please do. I can run around if we don't have a mic runner. Otherwise, we got it. Betsy's going to run.
Hey, great panel, great discussion. I just want to kind of take it from a higher order view of what's been happening around the world over the last decades. We're set in a mode of globalization, so there's economies of scale that were put to work around the world so the world could trade the crops and the goods and their manufacturing stuff with each other. You focus on what you're good at, someone else focuses on what they're good at, and we'll trade. So that's probably where the subsidies have gone in, but I think just kind of coming down to a question, do you think the model has to get reversed? We have to go into more of a localization method where farming becomes localized like it was centuries ago in London, where villages were built around farms and people ate that food and the livelihood was around food. Right now, food is more about convenience, something that you could get quick, which is why McDonald's probably took off. But do you think it's a thought process that has to get changed? And do we have to shift from globalization into localization?
You don't have to go back 200 years in England. You can just go back to London during the Blitz, and more than half the food was grown in gardens. And in the United States, about 35% of the food was grown in gardens. My sense is that, now I'm coming from the point of view of, Patagonia was founded by people who were climbers and surfers and who had a love of wild places and a love of the natural world. And in order to have a natural world, I think that we need to recover our sense of place and our sense of locality. So, I don't know what Hudson Valley probably produces, 2% of what New York eats right now. But it's certainly, and you don't want it to produce 100% because that doesn't provide food security. But you certainly can have a much better balance than we have right now. And you can have all of that food produced in a healthy way, which we don't have now. And then one of the problems with the principle of free market trade in agriculture is you now have a lot of countries that can't feed themselves. And that is terrible.
Yeah, I would support that and say that we definitely need to keep our regional farm and food economies very vibrant because it will help keep the topsoil on the earth. It will help feed local communities. You will put more money back into, for every dollar you spend in your local community on agriculture, you'll put another 10 back in. So it really makes a difference economically and also health-wise in terms of soil and keeping the topsoil where we need it. And just the cost of carbon and also the taste, because vegetables and fruits and vegetables that are largely water content are going to taste so much better when you eat them closer to the time of harvest, and they're going to have more nutrients in them. So just from that perspective alone, it's important too. And yes, we used to do it. We used to be much more, the garden moved to California, and we lost all of our infrastructure in the Hudson Valley, and we're busy rebuilding it now, and we need public-private partnerships to do that. We don't have processing plants. We don't have, I was part of a group that started a distribution company in the called Farm to Chef. It was one of the first where we could get local product into the marketplace of New York City, because farmers can't get off the farm. They need to be on the farm. Somebody else has to do the distribution. Green markets has made a huge difference for our area. There are now 55 green markets, and support a lot of farmers that way, and they do a great job with it.
I just want to put a plug in for crops like coffee that we can't grow locally. And so for things like that require a very specific climate that is not your local climate, we have all these tools now that allow us to go and get to know who our producers are, and we can use our dollars to support the producers that pay fair wages and take care of biodiversity and that kind of thing. So just put in a few minutes to get to know where you're spending your money and who you're supporting and who you're not. Whoa, okay, we have a lot of questions, so let's do maybe like 2 or 3 at a time. Sure.
Hi. First, thank you guys for this amazing panel, and just really respect everything you guys are working on. I'll start out, but I'm heavily influenced by two minds, E.O. Wilson and also Dixon Despommier. And E.O. Wilson wrote Half Earth, and he believes that in order to preserve and save biodiversity within the next 30 years, humans have to remove ourselves from about 50% of land and only be taking up 50% of terrestrial land. And then Dixon Despommier invented the vertical farm. And I'm a big fan of Dixon, yeah. And I guess my question is, we haven't brought up too much some of the really innovative techniques in agriculture as far as aeroponics, hydroponics, and aquaponics. And I'm a big fan of aerofarms and square roots, and I can see that if we were to hit a tipping point with some of these technologies like aerofarms and Gotham Greens, that we can be hyper-local with how we produce food, and also that maybe the farmers of the future are more into robotics and machine learning because they're already automating farms in San Francisco. So just wanted to understand what your guys' thought is of the intersection of tech and farming, because those are the areas that personally I'm really fascinated with, because I think they might be a large part of the solution, and I just wanted to hear what your guys' thoughts were. So, thanks.
We get a couple questions. You want a couple all at once? Yeah. Okay, sure. I know you had your hand up a couple times.
So during this panel, we talked about the importance of accelerating this program. And also during the intro, it was mentioned that around 1% of farmland in the United States is certified organic. So my question is it perhaps limiting to the regenerative standard that a base component is USDA organic certification? Would it perhaps be more applicable if this standard were open to farmland that was perhaps certified sustainable or certified biodynamic or something other than just USDA organic?
Hi there. Thank you all for your thoughts. I just wanted to ask for all of you in the Hudson Valley or in New York State specifically, what you see as the bright spots, who are your heroes, and what brands and farmers can we in this room support in order to take action on these issues?
Get right to the questions, I think on the question of tech, and I think broadly speaking, it's incredibly important that we have a lot of different methods of thinking and a lot of different disciplines at the table to figure out how we're going to all feed ourselves sustainably for the future. So that's something we spend a lot of time at Stonebarns trying to do, is convene people from an interdisciplinary perspective to make sure that we're not that we're getting the benefit of all different kinds of thinking, and innovation is incredibly important. The solutions are going to need to be creative. They're going to need to take advantage of everything that we have available to us today. It's not about going back 200 years, for sure. So I think, I think in terms of regenerative agriculture and the potential of soil to sequester carbon, I think we really do need to be emphasizing soil-based methods for that purpose and to that end. There's a lot of land that's in agriculture that could be farmed differently. We could be sequestering a lot of carbon. We could be moving to more perennial agriculture systems. We could be planting trees and fruits and orchards and more nuts and really looking at a lot of different solutions. I think there are, right now, one of the challenges with indoor ag is that I think there's at the moment, a relatively limited number of crops that you can grow in those environments, which is not to say that in the future that won't be, innovated and changed. I think it's really possible that the future and the solution on a regional basis, and I think it's somewhere between just the city and the whole globe, is what does a regional food system look like, and could indoor ag be a really important part of kind of major urban areas feeding themselves? Yeah, I think so, but I think we wouldn't want to do that to the exclusion of really looking at the soil and making sure that we're doing everything we can to get the soil to a healthier place where it's going to serve us for the long term. So I think we don't want to do one to the exclusion of the other.
I agree. One, just as a sort of like a mix between the question about things happening here and your point, every year there's a small conference called Mixing Bowl NYC, which really focuses on ag tech orientation, and the person who runs it, Rob Trice, he is married to someone who is on a regenerative system out in California. So he's really interesting that he has like a tech perspective, but also lives with this sort of like soil-based regenerative mindset. So, but I think I agree. I think both things could come together. I think just one or the other is probably not the right answer. I'm really fascinated by elements of indoor vertical farming as it pertains to reducing food miles, et cetera, and the transportation costs and emissions as part of it. I think what I have a lot of concern about, knowing how complex, like the complexity of soil is extremely difficult to mimic in terms of both flavor and all of the chemical processes that grow into, turning a seed into a plant. Like it blows my mind, you have a little packet of seeds and how much food comes out of this, like a few ounces of seed. And I'm personally not convinced that we're actually there yet with aquaponics and hydroponics, that we actually know how to fully mimic the circumstances that produce the healthy food we need. Because I'm also a believer in, I think a lot of trace minerals and other micronutrients are really key to our overall well-being, and I'm not always convinced a for-profit company in New Jersey is going to be making sure all of that is there in the process if they have, profitability-oriented mindset. So, but I would love to talk about it more. This would be a fun conversation later.
No, I think it's a really good example of kind of relationship to place. So when you live in the middle of a city, and if you can get your fresh greens from the block next door, that's fantastic. And you can build a community around that. Whereas if you live out in the Finger Lakes, say, and you're trying to capture your unique terroir in your bottle of wine, I don't see that kind of vertical farming becoming relevant. So it's really kind of, what's the place, what's the crop, and what's the system?
The one thing that I think has relevance for this is the E.O. Wilson half-earth idea that if we're going to restore natural systems to health, we need a lot of room for the critters and a lot of room in which where the hand of man is felt very lightly. But there's another issue, I think, which we haven't touched on, which is that the cities are basically extract value from rural economies. And one of the things we really need to do is to make that relationship between rural economy and the city healthy. And if you have that, it's almost like an old vision of the town, the farm, and the forest. That you have the town, which is where people live and make things, and you have farmland where we grow our food. And then the old idea of the forest becomes the new E.O. Wilson idea of land that's kept kind of a little bit out of reach, but also inhabited.
Do you want to take the question on that? Does the regenerative ag standard become limited by the requirement?
Yeah, you know, what we're looking at for that standard is kind of from the ground up. It does include a lot of what's in certified organic, but it's really a vision of what would make the soil healthy and what would support that. So I think that it's always a question with standards. If you reduce their, if you make them less difficult, you get more people involved, but then you also have, you don't get as much done that needs to be done. So I think that the standard that we're looking at, where we are looking at the 20 or something farms where we're testing out these ideas, but I think the ultimate standard will hold to what's good for the soil, what's good for nature, and what's good for human beings, rather than something that's easier entry. I'm not sure that was your question, but that would be the answer.
Which brands and farms to support?
Yeah, some you guys.
Yeah. Well, just about the organic standards, they took about 12 years to get written into the legislation, and I actually was in Washington in 2002 when that happened and heard Wes Jackson talk, because immediately the Beyond Organic movement was launched then. And because it didn't include animal welfare, there was nothing about workers' justice. Yeah, GM, there was a lot that was excluded. Biodynamic farming, you know, is beyond organic already, and I think the regenerative organics certification takes a lot of that work into consideration. So yeah, I mean, it's been something that we've all been working toward, and this is a wonderful opportunity that Patagonia has given with Rodale and Dr. Bronner's to just name it the Beyond Organic movement as what it ought to include. Some of the best producers that I work with in the Hudson Valley I can recommend, speaking of biodynamic farming, is Hawthorne Valley Farm, which is at the Union Square Green Market. They're one of the original farmers there. And their growing practices are wonderful. And I just encourage all of you to think about where your food is coming from and to learn from your producers. And I certainly recommend the Green Market as a place to start.
Oh, okay. Thank you for this great panel. My name is Katari. I am a research collaborator with Carbon Sponge. We look into regenerative agriculture in urban areas. So I have two question sets. One of them is that, isn't regenerative agriculture another spin of ethnopedology, all these indigenous technologies that have been in place for thousands of years into soil security, food security? Are not these things combined together? And that's my question. Like, what are your thoughts into bringing ethnopedology into the curriculum of these new farmers that's coming up? Second is, where do you see urban agriculture heading in regenerative agriculture, also into the phase of carbon sequestration in this global climate change and the island heat effect that's happening right here in New York City? But we have hundreds, if not close to 1,000 urban farms that needs tremendous training and tremendous economic support. We are in the trenches, we are fighting, we are doing that, but funding seems to be lacking. What do you think is that? What is happening? And we are trying to develop these trainings. We want to see, make it hyper local in the sense that we are using the ethnopedology of this community of hundreds and thousands of immigrants that wants to farm and grow their own food here.
Thanks for your comments. I just had a quick question. We talked a lot about agriculture, restorative agriculture, and technology relating to that. As someone who works in renewable energy, wind and solar energy, I think the two don't operate in silos, so I just want to get your kind of comments on where does renewable energy, being wind, solar, biomass, fit into this conversation about restorative agriculture, and kind of how they're really tangential industries or conversations.
Hi. Forgive my ignorance on the matter. I was just curious as to what the landscape is currently with farmers as it relates to taxes and benefits provided. And I just know small business owners in New York often come to New York to New York State for the first time, and after their first year of business tax, they're just scared out of the state. And if there are to be more farmers under the age of 30, as to how do we build awareness as to the benefits, or if there are property tax incentives to reserving private property to farming, et cetera, as to exactly what the relationship is with taxes and farmers yeah.
For me. I have friends in the room, in the audience, who work on this, so we'll try and connect you guys up afterwards. But one of the things folks are starting to realize is that the parts of the world where the most biodiversity is left, where it's best preserved, is where indigenous communities are the stewards. So finally, we're realizing we need to look to that wisdom. And so I'm really glad that you brought that up. To the renewable energy question, that's actually where I've done much of my work as well, so thank you for that. Renewable energy and sustainable regenerative agriculture go perfectly hand in hand. I'm always amazed at the parallels between the experience in renewable energy and the experience in regenerative ag, where forever renewables were patted on the head as just some nice little quaint thing that would never power the world. The big boys, use dirty energy. That's what powers the world. And finally, it's just been relatively recent that, we've finally gotten to the critical mass and scale and driven down costs to get to the point where we can finally start to really dispel those myths. And now in regenerative agriculture, we need to get to that scale in the landscape and in these marketplaces through these reciprocal relationships, through these long-term contracts, through expanded access to finance, and all of these innovations in the marketplace so that we can get to the critical mass to prove that you can feed the world with healthy farming systems, and it doesn't have to be the broken paradigm. So I think it fits perfectly. I think every farm has the space to install renewables projects, but it becomes difficult because, as you know, every renewables project is a struggle. You need the permits, you need to get the utility to give you permission. So I am actually even more, on my family's farm at Hunt Country Vineyards, we have 350 solar panels, we have geothermal heating and cooling, we have 5 electric vehicle chargers, and every single project was a struggle, and I'm not gonna lie, it's hard. So I'm actually more excited in terms of the ability to scale and move with speed in soil carbon and regenerative agriculture, because the farmers have to make the decision, and they probably already have a lot of the equipment, and they may need some support and training and some financing, but it can happen quickly. You don't have all of those battles that you have with every renewables project. So yeah, I think they go together, and each has their own struggles, but absolutely the two communities should be working much more closely together. And sorry, I could talk about this all night. Just to another point on that is that as farmers are both a solution to climate change, and we're also victims of climate change. And so one of the things that farmers have to do, the few farmers that are left, is figure out new revenue streams. And so renewables projects and carbon payments for their soil carbon are all these new diversified revenue streams that you can help you make it through a year where you get another flood, and then the next year you get a drought, and then the next year you get hit with polar vortex winters that just, blaze your crops. So, these revenue streams from renewable energy projects and these other things, and maybe hopefully carbon soil payments, can actually help keep our farmers farming. So I'm gonna, sorry, keep going.
Actually, I'm going to throw this back to you, Suzanne. We went to, this is a little bit to the point of the wisdom of other cultures and farming. And a lot of the people who are working in regenerative organic are saying some of the same things, that you actually basically have to kind of listen to the soil. You have to pay attention to what it wants. And we visited Klaus Martin last fall, and it was an interesting combination of him. He's, a Rudolf Steiner advocate, so he's looking at some of this folk knowledge, and at the same time importing very sophisticated technology from Germany to help him grow grains. So just as an illustration of the complexity of what's possible.
Anyone who's still farming, they may, like Klaus and like his family and like my dad and my brother, you see them out in the field and they're in ripped up jeans and, suspenders, and they're probably incredibly innovative and incredibly intuitive, because if they've been able to survive this long. So there's a huge amount of wisdom and knowledge and experience there that I'm hoping that this community, with things like podcasts and web forums and investment forums and things, we can actually kind of leverage that for this transition. Tell them who Klaus Martin is. Klaus and Mary Howell Martin and their son Peter are farming in, they're our neighbors, and they farm 1,600 or more acres fully organically. They own Lakeview Grain, and they're featured heavily in the Third Plate, Dan Barber's book, and they've been teaching other farmers about and helping and supporting the community where in the Finger Lakes where we are, learning about soil health, and really, as Vincent was saying, understanding what the soil needs, what each crop needs, and I think there's just this, that for a long time the mindset was kind of beating nature into submission, and now we're realizing we have to understand nature and work with ecology and work with it, and it actually works better.
And also that they were originally conventional farmers and used a lot of poison. So it's Klaus and Mary, how they made a transition, realizing that they were poisoning themselves with these poisons, and their children, and so they changed their ways.
And their Mennonite farmer neighbors have been highly skeptical until they saw the yields go up. Now they're hanging around.
And I have one. I'm going to stick with the mic since my voice goes nowhere out of my mouth. One thing I'm thinking of on the indigenous practices comment is that, so I was at NOFO New York, which is the Northeast Organic Farming Association, up in the middle of winter when you can actually get farmers out into a conference. And Leah Penniman, who is from Soul Flower Farm, which has been mentioned a few times, was in a room of farmers, and she said, raise your hand if you practice permaculture. And I think 90% of the people raised their hands. And her response was, permaculture doesn't exist. It is indigenous practices repackaged by white people who went to liberal arts schools, who look like me. And so it immediately sparked a realization in me that she was completely correct, and she actually started going through these different practices from all over the world, saying, where did this actually come from? And so I want to relate it to it. Something that I've been thinking about in this educational training new farmers perspective is actually making sure that story is told in learning these new practices. Similarly, a lot of the programs are only in English. If you look at the agricultural system, a lot of the current labor workforce are not English speakers, or at least not as their first language. So I think that's important. And then it goes back to the point as well that was harking to my existential crisis about where the money was coming from and how to sort of reimagine the way that finance is approaching helping the solution that has to mirror the way that agricultural practices are changing to be holistic and be, thinking of the social and ecological. I think this process requires as much unlearning as it does learning. That's something I see a lot of people going through, is learning new things, relearning things that they haven't thought about in a long time, and then also identifying internally what you need to unlearn from your current mindset. So.
Yep. All right, we'll get a bunch more questions from this side and from the middle. Oh, the tax questions.
The incentive in New York State for tax is just you have to earn $10,000 a year in agriculture in order to have your land be considered agricultural land by New York State, and that reduces your tax, your real estate tax. Yeah.
Hi, so thank you so much for this conversation. I have a question about cost. So I work, I'm a doctoral student at Teachers College, and we're doing a study, the Return to Scratch Cooking pilot in the Bronx. And so we have Chef Dan Giusti, who started this program, and we're bringing fresh foods into schools and creating meals from scratch. But one of the things that was really difficult and prohibitive was being able to even source local produce. And so what is the cost associated with this practice, and how long does it take for farmers to handle that cost to be able to be competitive in price as well?
I just wanted to say thank you for offering your differing perspectives. I'm kind of coming from a more of a sociological, sustainable perspective. And really what I want to know about, we talked about a little bit kind of risk incorporated and in this sort of practice. So I just wanted to ask you guys, I mean, again, you guys sort of interact with different people on a different basis. So I wanted to see sort of, you know, how can we show people, by people I mean investors, farmers, politicians, and consumers, that it is a long-term investment, both, you know, or not just both, in our health, in our economy, and just for future generations. And sorry, on a kind of a discourse level. So through discourse, how can we go about that?
Hi, thank you. My name is Ray Figueroa. I'm president of the New York City Community Garden Coalition. I'm also a community farmer in the South Bronx. Yes, peace and blessings to all of our community farmers. My question has to do with really taking a systems thinking, systems analytical perspective. I subscribe to the thinking that was put forth by Kenneth Dahlberg when he talked about transition from agriculture. He has a piece called Transition from Agriculture to Regenerative Food Systems, where he emphasizes the 3 E's: ethics, equity, as well as ecology. I would like to offer that we need more of a systems and analytical perspective being brought to bear on the discussion of regenerative agriculture. Why? Because a systems perspective will talk about things happening above agriculture and things happening below agriculture. In this case, I just want to talk about land policy. A lot of folks that are enjoying agriculture in, let's say, the peri-urban regions of the Hudson Valley are basically benefiting from the privilege that was structured, the race privilege that was structured as a result of land use policies working in concert with each other. Urban-rural policies such as exclusionary zoning, redlining, urban renewal, restrictive covenants, so forth and so on, allowed for certain folks to have access to land. Within the community of color, the African descendant community, since the post-slavery Reconstruction period, we had 40 acres and a mule, and that was pulled in within a year. The 40 acres and a mule was pulled. Then, you know, fast forward to the second half of the 20th century, we have the Pickford class action, where black farmers were fighting just to have equal access to loans and other development resources from the USDA. To us community farmers who are fighting for every square inch and square foot in the city to do community agriculture. By the way, as a brother suggested about urban agriculture, in community agriculture, we are regenerative. We're forced to be so because of the nature of what, but so we're recycling, we're carbon sequestering, we are rotating, we're raised beds, so we're mitigating stormwater runoff. Anyway, my point is, how do we really look at this from the perspective of food justice, from the perspective of real promoting equity. A regenerative systems perspective really has us looking at local communities, how they're impacted by what's happened in terms of what I just alluded to in terms of land use policies. What we call the long feedback loop. Systems thinking has you looking at long feedback loops, and policymakers have very short time horizons in terms of their tenures in office. So they really don't really look at these things from a long-term perspective. So, your thoughts?
No, I think we alluded to that briefly in the question of distribution, the question of access. It's really critical that this becomes a part of the movement in addition to financing, in addition to policy. So, and I don't know what to say beyond that. No.
I want to thank everyone who's raised these issues, because I think these are absolutely critical that we address the question you brought up about price and about the terrible history that the American agriculture system has in terms of just outright discriminatory policy towards Black farmers, and that's something that we. I think in terms of the price question specifically, we really do need to go back and look at policy, because again, the only kind of farming that we're really supporting right now is commodity agriculture. And if farmers are going to make a living growing other foods, we really do need policy that's going to support them to do that, and we need insurance programs that are going to support them. Someone mentioned risk management. Farming is very risky, and it's even more risky now in the face of climate change, although one thing you can do to mitigate risk, of course, is use regenerative practices, because you're going to be diversifying and you're going to be mitigating risk in a number of ways. But in any case, I think it's really, really urgent that we push for more support of this kind of agriculture, because right now the people who are producing this kind of food are doing it without any kind of real supports, and so it is definitely it's more expensive than it should be if a lot of people are going to be able to afford it. No question.
Whoa. That felt like a bad karaoke moment. So I want to mention something that you said, and then I'll speak to cost as well, with hopefully two specific examples. One thing I think that's interesting, or that I see as a positive direction, is some of these farmer education groups. I mean, quite honestly, a lot of these really great, good-minded nonprofits, they're still mostly white people consistently. They still have very privileged funding sources. And so something I have seen is that a few of these collaborative initiatives have an intentional equity and inclusion component, where they're bringing in consultants to essentially be like, what are our blind spots? Make sure that you're checking us in terms of our plan, but also making sure that if someone is coming in the room and is not well represented, that they're not the only ones burdening the whole process of educating all the white people in the room. And an interesting example specifically around land, as you mentioned, another hat that I've been working on is trying to figure out how community investment and democratization of investment could be helpful, because a lot of these projects we're talking about are funded only by hyper wealthy individuals who have really great hearts and minds, but they're still the ones investing, and if any benefit comes from it, they're still the one getting it. So one group that's working on this is Karen Washington, Olivia Watkins, and all these people about the Black Farmers Fund. And I've been working with one group trying to figure out how to, make a community investment vehicle for the Hudson Valley. And we're talking with them in terms of how specifically can these privileged groups with resources actually actively make it part of their mission to reallocate resources to these groups. So hopefully that's something. It sounds like you already know them. And then on the cost component, so confessions, I used to work for a massive $30 billion a year distributor that was, the evil that we want to go away from. But I went there to learn how they're extraordinarily good at some things like the efficiency of, procurement or transportation or finance and costing. And so I think something I've seen practically in the Hudson Valley is if the consolidation made it to where a lot of the infrastructure is gone, as Mary mentioned, a lot of it is springing up. But in order to make the cost such that it is accessible to people, there are certain elements of it I think that we need to get really good at making as efficient as possible. So as a concrete example, I work with a company that they source all organic, as much biodynamic as they can. It's actually associated with Hawthorne Valley, and they make lacto-fermented vegetables, so sauerkrauts and kimchis and fermented hot sauces. The agricultural practices are extraordinary in the products that are coming into this company, and we focused really heavily on trying to both make the company work, but also how to make it an affordable price point at the end by automating certain elements of it very heavily. So there's certain things where we didn't think that automating would be good because it's sort of, I'm kind of anti-robot in a lot of ways, but we tried to automate, it's like the 3 Ds of robotics, which I will probably forget. It's like dangerous, dirty, and dull or something like that. And so for as a concrete example, I defined the most costly component of the business was packing sauerkraut into the jar with your hand, which is makes you cramp. It's horrible. And a human can do on average about 4 jars a minute. We spent a couple years trying to find the right machine, which actually interestingly is meant to pack tobacco, which is funny. But the machine itself does 45 jars a minute. So there are things like that we've actually able to reduce our labor cost in that one specific area that allows both the company to finally hit a point where it can sustain itself, but also it can go at a price point that's just not exceedingly ridiculous to the consumer, because you don't want to be buying $15, $20 jars of kraut. So I think there are things like that in terms of finding the agriculture in the middle, where we can preserve the high integrity of some practices, and then some things we probably should try to figure out where are the places that we really should try to just drive down cost as much as possible, both to make this entity work, but also to make it affordable to not just, Manhattanites.
I just want to add about the cost that along with get big and get out was have food be cheap. And so, it became this idea that food should be cheap. And this country, is the only one that spends less percentage of their income on food. And the costs, don't kid yourself, are all absorbed elsewhere in our, terribly unhealthy population, and also in our, the deterioration of our topsoil, which can only be replaced in an ice age. So the costs are there. They're just not at the cash register.
There are also a lot of other things in terms of getting costs down for farmers. If you're a farmer and you've put all this effort into bringing your soil carbon up to 6% and all your neighbors are down at 1 or 2, your insurance premiums should be less. Your risk is less in the next flood, in the next drought. A lot of farmers get their financing from their local banks. We could, without a lot of money, we could create a training program for bankers, for local bankers, to bring them up to speed on renewables, on soil carbon, on regenerative farming, so that they realize that they don't have to charge as much interest on these loans. So there's all kinds of ways to get these costs down. I think we're going to do a couple quick questions, and then we're going to have to wrap up.
Thank you. Jeff Poten from Columbia University. I would really appreciate if the panel could speak about the fallacy of yield comparison between regenerative farming and conventional farming, because our current farming system has between 30 and 40%, I should say our current food system has between 30 and 40% waste. 30% of our corn is grown for biofuel. Another 35% is grown for animal feed. A goodly amount of our grains are used for products, excuse me for being disparaging, but Fritos corn chips, not nutritional. So when we talk about the need, when the conventional ag community talks about the need for yield equivalency, their eyes are closed to the fact that so much of their yield is not nutritious. So if the panel could speak to that, I'd greatly appreciate it.
Thanks. Hi. I'm Juliette Majot from the Institute for Agriculture and Trade Policy in Minneapolis. So from a really different part of the country with a different kind of agricultural system. I want to talk about the just transition We're in a time where the kind of change that we would like to do from the grassroots on up takes a particular amount of time and change. Yet U.S. farmers have been put in the position of selling their yields, particularly commodity farmers, for under the price of production for 20 or 30 years now, on average. They are carrying the debt, they're carrying the risk. And I think that a lot of this is, well, I know a lot of it is tied up in international trade agreements, such as NAFTA, which we're hearing a lot about right now. I think that we will have a transition in agriculture because we must. Because of climate change, literally, because of water pollution, because of air pollution, because our farmers are 65 years and older, and because, according to the latest USDA census, middle-sized farms have been completely carved out. We now have young micro farmers and get bigger, get out big farmers. So the middle is out, and I'm interested in hearing more about young farmers and the work that you've been supporting. I wanted to say, somebody asked about organizations to support, and I wanted to give a pitch for the Land Stewardship Partnership that does incredible work with young farmers, and for the Rural Coalition in the South that works with farmers of color and has for many, many, many years. Farmers are committing suicides at higher rates than they have in a long time. I don't think people in the United States understand that, and I don't think that people in the United States understand what the loss of the family farm has really meant. I'm really interested in the power of Patagonia, the marketing, high visibility, incredible brand recognition that Patagonia carries. And I wonder if it's possible. There are two things I'd love to see. I'd love to see Americans understand the difference between the term farmer and the term agribusiness. And I would love to see people understand the difference or come to understand that we shouldn't talk about food as a specialty crop, and we should talk about it as food. And I think Patagonia could make that happen, actually.
Someone was asking about local products and organizations to support, and I just want to mention, because I don't think it's been mentioned, but that we've all night long been drinking the wine of Hunt Country Vineyards, Suzanne's family farm, and that people don't really understand that there's really amazing fine wine in New York. So I think we can start by supporting.
I didn't ask her to say that.
But I was just very surprised that that was not kind of mentioned and pointed out. And it's such good wine. And before I knew Suzanne, I didn't know that there was such amazing wine, especially in the Finger Lake region. So you can all do that. And
we need to hire her for marketing.
Buy bottles of wine. And the other question that I had, just out of really asking because I don't know, in the field of land-based reparations and that kind of stuff, and you were mentioning an organization that pairs farmers with vacant land, but are there organizations, I do a lot of work with a lot of indigenous communities in New York, and their lands are some of the most polluted lands in the world with PCBs and aluminum and dumping and all of these things. Are there organizations really working with some of these indigenous communities who are traditionally farming communities to try and, involve them in farming with more healthy places, healthy soils in the Hudson Valley, the Mohawk Valley, and do these organizations really exist?
And I just want to point out that Mary and her team prepared all of the food, so if that wasn't stated 3 times, that was...
I just know about the Iroquois Corn Project. That's the only local indigenous one that I know. There's also Indian Harvest in the Midwest, I think it's in Minnesota, which are both for-profit businesses that are working specifically with indigenous populations on product.
Related also, in not just in terms of supporting farmers. The Soul Fire Farm, which has been mentioned a bunch of times, has something called a reparations map, and you can actually go on and support specific farming projects that are led by people of color. And it's highly specific about what kind of investment or what they're looking for in order to make their farming operations viable and sustainable. So it's a great, very practical tool if you want to donate directly to support farmers of color.
And they're trained to.
I would just add that there's also an education center connected to the Iroquois White Corn Project, the Ganadagan Center in central New York and Victor, New York.
Right. Jelly says
Thank
there's
you.
an education center connected to the Iroquois Project. Great. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah.
And Soul Fire Farm is specifically training black farmers to try and keep black land in black ownership with farmers who are be trained to take over. So that Soul Fire Farm is outside of Troy, New York, by the way. It's, right.
And one quick comment for the point on yield, just to give another concrete Hudson Valley example, is actually associated with Stone Barns. It's Dan Barber co-founded a new seed company called Row 7 with one of the main Cornell seed breeders. And it was around a conversation where Dan asked the seed breeders, like, can you make a butternut squash smaller and taste better? And I have to like cram it with butter and all these other things. And the response from the seed breeder was, you're the first person to ever ask me to breed for flavor in his entire life.
And the honey nut squash was born.
And the honey nut squash was born. And so now it's interesting in terms of how you approach not just focusing on yield, but these other elements. Now Row 7 is actually working with a chef collaborative network, trying to both breed for not just yield, or not just, how many chips in the bottom of a Lay's bag can we make sure they don't break. They're doing for nutrient density, for what role they play on the farm. Can you eat the whole plant or just a piece of it? All these different elements. So I think it's interesting to see where that element of yield is ingrained, both in terms of the farmers, but also the seed breeding system and all these other components.
So we are just about out of time, but they are going to ask us all to go downstairs and eat more food and drink more wine. So I'm going to let Vincent wrap up with any final remarks. I do want to let everyone know to look in your inboxes. You'll be getting an email from the Patagonia team with links to all of our websites, so you can sign up for everyone's newsletters, so we can continue to weave this community together that's trying to solve all these problems and develop all these delicious foods and wines together, and clothing and everything else. So thank you all for coming. Thank you for bringing up the point about family farmers. We are an endangered species, and so we have to change that. So thank you for bringing that up.
I want to let you all go to eat the asparagus and drink the wine. Just briefly, touching, we're talking about justice for farmers of color. There's Susan Chang, who's sitting next to you, and I went to visit a place called Bed-Stuy Fresh and Local about 3 years ago, and it had the best vegetables I've ever bought in New York. And one of the things we thought when we came out of the store was, the first rent increase they have, they're going to be out of business. And so I think it's worth also asking, how are we going to provide for low-margin businesses that are really necessary? How are we going to make that real estate available and keep that available to stores? Thank you all for coming. Oh, and I duly noted as to whether Patagonia will continue to illustrate the difference between agribusiness and farmers. I think that that's something that we're very conscious of, and partly this event is to connect the communities of eaters, farmers, chefs, grocers, citizens. So thank you so much, and please enjoy the food downstairs.